The highborn ones perished in the midst of the ruins, and all the strength of the land was stricken. Even the great one, the firstborn of Pharaoh, died with the highborn in the midst of the terror and falling stones. The children of princes were cast out into the streets, and those who were not cast out died within their abodes. There were 9 days of darkness and upheaval, while a tempest raged such as never had been known before. When it passed away, brother buried brother throughout the land. Men rose up against those in authority and fled from the cities to dwell in tents in the outlands. Egypt lacked great men to deal with the times. The people were weak from fear and bestowed gold, silver, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and copper upon the slaves, and to their priests they gave chalices, urns, and ornaments. Pharaoh alone remained calm and strong in the midst of confusion. The people turned to wickedness in their weakness and despair. Harlots walked through the streets unashamed. Women paraded their limbs and flaunted their womanly charms. Highborn women were in rags, and virtuous were mocked. The story of the slaves from the Egyptian point of view. They turned before Nashari and stopped at Shukoth, the place of quarries. They passed the waters of Mahah and came by the valley of Pakroth, northward of Marah. They came up against the waters which blocked their way, and their hearts were in despair. The night was a night of fear and dread, for there was a high moaning above and black winds from underworld that were loosed, and fire sprang up from the ground. The hearts of the slaves shrank within them, for they knew the wrath of Pharaoh followed them, and that there was no way of escape. They hurled abuse on those who led them. Strange rites were performed along the shores that night. The slaves disputed among themselves, and there was violence. Pharaoh had gathered his army and followed the slaves. After he departed, there were riots and disorders behind him, for the cities were plundered. The laws were cast out of the judgment halls and trampled underfoot in the streets. The storehouses and granaries were burst open and robbed. Roads were flooded, and none could pass along them. People lay dead on every side. The palace was split, and the princes and officials fled, so that none was left with authority to command. The list of numbers were destroyed. Public places were overthrown. Households became confused, unknown. Pharaoh pressed on in sorrow, for behind him was desolation and death. Before him were things he could not understand, and he was afraid. But he carried himself well and stood before his host with courage. He sought to bring back the slaves, for the people said their magic was greater than the magic of Egypt. The host of Pharaoh came upon the slaves by the saltwater shores, but was held back from them by a breath of fire. A great cloud was spread over the host and darkened the sky. None could see except for the fiery glow and the unceasing lightning which rent the covering cloud overhead. A whirlwind arose in the east and swept over the encamped host. A gale raged all night, and in the red twilight dawn, there was a movement of the earth. The waters receded from the seashore and were rolled back on themselves. There was a strange silence, and in the gloom, it was seen that the waters had parted, leaving a passage between. The land had risen, but it was disturbed and trembled. The way was not straight or clear. The waters about were as if spun within a bowl. The swamp land alone remained undisturbed. From the horn of the destroyer came a high, shrilling noise which stopped the ears of men. The slaves had been making sacrifices in despair. Their lamentations were loud. Now, before the strange sight, there was hesitation and doubt. For the space of a breath, they stood still and silent. Then all was confusion and shouting, some pressing forward into the waters against all who sought to flee back from the unstable ground. Then, in exultation, their leader led them into the midst of the waters through the confusion, yet many sought to turn back into the host behind them, while others fled along the empty shores. All became still over the sea and upon the shore, but behind the earth shook and boulders split with a great noise. The wrath of heaven was removed to a distant and stood upwards of the two hosts. Still, the host of Pharaoh held its ranks, firm and resolved before the strange and awful happenings, and undaunted by the fury which raged by their side. Stern faces were lit darkly, by the fiery curtain. Then the fury departed, and there was silence. Stillness spread over the land, while the host of Pharaoh stood without movement in the red glow. Then, with a shout, the captains went forward, and the host rose up behind them. The curtain of fire had rolled up into a dark billowing cloud, which spread out as a canopy. There was a stirring of the waters. But they followed the evildoers past the place of the great whirlpool. The passage was confused in the midst of the waters, and the ground beneath unstable. Here, in the midst of the tumult of waters, Pharaoh fought against the hindmost of the slaves and prevailed over them. And there was a great slaughter amid the sand, the swamp, and the water. The slaves cried out in despair, but their cries were unheeded. Their possessions were scattered behind them as they fled, so that the way was easier for them than those who followed. Then the stillness was broken by a mighty roar, and through the roaring pillar of cloud, the wrath of the destroyer descended upon the host. The heavens roared as with 1,000 thunders, and the bowels of the earth were sundered, and the earth shrieked in its agony. The cliffs were torn away and cast down. The dry ground fell beneath the waters, and great waves broke upon the shore, sweeping in rocks from seaward. The great surge of rocks and waters overwhelmed the chariots of the Egyptians who went before the footmen. The chariots of Pharaoh's were hurled into the air as if by a mighty hand, and was crushed in the midst of the rolling waters. Tidings of the disaster came back to Regmon, son of Tomah, who hastened on ahead of the terrified survivors because of his burning. He brought reports into the people that the host had been destroyed by blast and deluge. The captains had gone, the strong men had fallen, and none remained to command. Therefore, the people revolted because of the calamities which had befallen them. Cowards slunk from their lairs and came forth boldly to assume the high offices of the dead. Comely and noble women, their protectors gone, were nothing but prey. Of the slaves, the greater number had perished before the host of Pharaoh. I hope you see that this is a different but similar story to the one you most likely read in your Bibles. That is, if you believe in the Bible. But what I have found is that everything that I have found in the Bible about events such as this have been taken from other cultures. This is a story about Pharaoh's scribes who witnessed this event. Now, the slaves were not millions. They were in the hundreds. They were practicing magic. Did they commandeer this event? Was this event actually a living, sentient being? Is this where this being lives and visits the earth, however long a period it is? And the events, the earth, the weather, all turned upside down. The end? Not even close. I hope you've enjoyed this. Let me know.
This is Charles Fort. This is in 1931. I now have a theory that once upon a time we were real and alive, but departed into this state that we call existence, that we have carried over with us from the real existence from which we died. The ideas of truth and of axioms and principles and generalizations, ideas that really meant something when we were really alive. But that, of course, now, in our phantom existence, which is demonstrable by any X-ray photograph of any of us, can have only phantom meaning. So then, our never-ending but always frustrated search for our lost reality. We come upon chimera and mystification, but persistently have beliefs as retentions from an experience in which there were things that we once believed in. This is the closest approximation to somebody could have made in 1931 before computers to the idea that we were existing in a simulation and that we are avatars. We are programming living within bodies that we perceive as bodies by this external stimuli. We are connected through our central nervous system. But it's all phantom. He was right.